Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. This episode is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Call us at 719-452-4803. Here's your host, Trevor Sherry.
In the past few weeks, I've really thought a lot about some of the role models in my life, especially in early childhood. And one of the individuals that came up pretty frequently was Mr. Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he just spoke such identity and such meaning into the kids that he was talking to and lived a life that was really admirable. And one of the most meaningful lessons that he taught was this emotional self-awareness. He had a song called "What Do You Do?" And it was saying, what do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. Do you play with some dough? Do you do these productive things, or do you do these things that are out of that anger? And then going into this emotional awareness of recognizing you can stop. Mm-hmm. And there's a beauty that comes from being able to say that I am not going to act out of my anger. I'm going to be the bigger person over my emotions. So I wanted to talk to you, Dr. Mayfield, about emotional intelligence, especially around what do you do with the mad that you feel? What do you do when you're so angry that you feel like there's nothing you can do other than retaliate or to punch a wall or bite?
Right. I think it's interesting they use the word emotional intelligence, and I think it's such a buzzword nowadays that I don't think people understand exactly what that means and what it is. I think we equate that to a cognitive intelligence around emotions, and it's not. It's a complete awareness around how we feel and what we feel and where we feel it and why we're feeling it. And I mean, it's a complex system, and it's not taught anymore. Like, we don't have a Fred Rogers anymore.
Right.
And thinking about where Dr. Rogers started, I mean, it was in the 70s and 80s, maybe even sooner than that. I don't know. Yeah. And it was before our iPhones and our iPads and our video game consoles and our TVs, right?
Yeah.
And so we were teaching kids this idea of let's pay attention. Let's explore that mad and that anger, where a lot of times we just breeze right through it nowadays. And so I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I don't know if we can have it fully in one podcast.
Right.
And we may need to do another one around this idea of emotional intelligence. And I don't even know if I like to use that word anymore, just because it is a buzzword. But let's get back to emotions.
Yeah.
And I know you and I have talked about this a lot, that we often in our society equate good emotions and bad emotions.
Yes.
Like, if I'm happy, it's good. And if I'm joyful, it's good. And if I'm feeling pleasure in some way, it's good. And if I'm not, it's bad. Or if I'm angry, it's bad. If I'm mad, it's bad. And I think so we put those, that the anger or the mad, the frustration, in this category of bad. And so when we begin to feel that, now we're somehow an evil person.
Yeah. Or
somehow we're not good enough or not right. And I think one of the things that we need to do right now in this podcast is set the record straight that there are no bad emotions. There are good emotions, or easy emotions, or however you want to categorize that, and then there are hard emotions. And if we can create it that way, then these hard emotions over here maybe are something that we begin to work through and understand, so that they become less hard.
And what about feelings that you should feel? If somebody tells you you shouldn't feel that way, what about that? Because I know we've had discussions about that as well.
I don't think anybody can tell you how you feel, or how you should feel, or how you could feel, or how you are in control of that. It's your experience. I feel this way because of something. Now, we can't blame it on somebody else.
Yeah.
But it's a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a natural progression and reaction to an external stimuli. Now, I just got really scientific there, but it's basically going, if you punch me, I'm going to be pretty upset about that.
Right.
If you slap me, I'm not, or if I get in a car accident, I'm going to be angry, or I'm going to be upset. And it's those things that we need to go, that's not bad. That's a natural reaction, and that's okay. And so what do you do with that? And that's why we're having this conversation. What do you do with the mad that you feel? I think is a good title for this podcast. And it's so much more than that. but it's that conversation that we've had about responsibility. I don't know if we've had this conversation yet. Maybe we need to add this to our list. But about responsibility, about ownership, about the fact that if I'm mad, I'm the one choosing to stay mad, even though that situation made me mad. So what do I do with that? And a lot of us, like, what's been your natural reaction to anger?
I think it's been very variant depending on the situation. Some days I do really well of being able to handle my emotions and take that responsibility, understanding that I am responsible for my own emotional state,
right.
And I'm responsible for how I take it. If you punch me in the face, I'm responsible not only for my natural reaction of anger, but how I react out of that. Other days, not so much. Other days, it's so easy to, I mean, they may be harder emotions, but I feel like they're easy to brew in.
Yes, I think that's it's a good analysis. I know for me, I don't know if anybody ever told me this, but I somehow assumed this thought processes that I can't be angry. Again, I don't know. I ever remember my dad or my mom telling me that don't be angry, you can't be angry or whatever. But that became my story. And so, how did I handle my anger? Like when I was going through middle school and my being bullied and having those intense struggles, I couldn't be angry about it. So instead, I turned inward. I took it out on myself. And I think that's and we have to be very cognizant and reflective, and so this far in the podcast, our listeners, if they've listened from the beginning to now, it's this idea of awareness, and they're probably rolling their eyes right now because we talk about this idea of awareness and reflection, but we have to be very cognizant and very honest about how we handle our emotions. And again, it's not like, it's not a good or a bad, it's what is. And I think it's a starting point for us to go, where am I in the spectrum? Do I handle them well? Do I stuff them? Do I talk about them? Do I react?
Yeah. And I think a lot of this is not in the moment of anger. It's afterwards, reflecting on moments of anger and how did you react? What was the feeling that you initially felt? And how did you act afterwards? Because I think you have a quote that you mentioned a podcast or two ago about the moment between the occurrence of an event or circumstance, and then there's a time for reaction. And during that time between action and reaction is where growth happens.
Sure, yeah. Viktor Frankl said it, the time between stimulus and response, there's space. And in that space, we have choice and freedom.
Wow, such a better way to put it than what I was trying to do.
But I don't know if we realize that. I don't think we slow down enough to go, okay, between that stimulus, between that fact that my car didn't start this morning, and when I back in the house, and now I'm yelling at my kids because I'm frustrated, but they did nothing wrong. Yeah, there's that space of how I'm going to handle that. And because of our fast pace, it's funny because we used to call it the microwave generation. If my popcorn's not done in 3 minutes, I'm going to be upset. I think it's even faster than that now. It's the high-speed wireless network generation or whatever, that if things aren't happening so quick, somehow now we're upset, or and we have to slow down. That's why I love some of the tenets of the Buddhistic mindset and Buddhism, in the sense that it's a self-reflection, going deeper, meditation, understanding, and the more we do it, the better we get. So the more we practice that slowing down and that reflection, that meditation piece, that self-awareness piece, that we become a lot better at catching it before it's too late.
Yeah. And I want to point our listeners back to our episode about have patience, growth takes time, that it's the little steps. It doesn't happen all at once or in this big step. And so when we're talking about our emotions and we're being reflective about it, and that moment between stimulus and reaction, there's going to be this slow progression of growth that is going to happen. It's not all going to happen overnight.
It's not. And I think when we begin to understand the space between the stimulus and response, and we have that intentional cognitive reaction where we slow down, we're going to be able to begin the process of self-discovery and learning. One of my favorite books right now is this idea of how God changes our brain, and it's not written by a religious guy. It's written by a guy that has really explored the power of meditation and the power of the fact that when we fill that space with God, and he keeps on saying, however that God looks to you, and we realize how much it strengthens our brain, and it strengthens this part of the brain called the anterior cingulate, which is actually the connecting piece between our emotional flight, fight, or freeze reaction to our cognitive processing and our creative processes. And he has a brain scan in there that I think is fascinating, and it's this idea that the more this guy meditated, the stronger the anterior cingulate got, and the more he was able to make sense of his emotions in the moment and not be so reactionary. And there's something to that, and it's fascinating. The old adage that what you listen to, you so become. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know I heard that a lot growing up. Well, don't listen to that kind of music because you're going to become that. And I kind of scoff at it, or don't watch those video games, or play the, whatever. And you kind of laugh at that. But it's funny, what we fill our mind with is a lot of times how we begin to react and interact. And so if we're intentional about, whether it be, if you're a Christian, it's, prayer and scripture reading. If it's, if you're a Buddhist, it's the meditation piece of, repeating something over and over again. If it's, if you're not religious at all, it's getting out in nature, or however that might look for you. But it's practicing these things over and over and over again in repetition that strengthens that part of the brain. So we're not reacting out of the fight, flight, or freeze now. Is the fight, fight, or freeze is kicking off, and we're having our emotional reaction, but it's such a quick connection to the frontal cortex. Now we're going, oh, why am I feeling this way? Why am I triggered?
Yeah. So what about the person who, right after listening to this podcast, gets into a situation where somebody punches them in the face? You've got the stimulus, and then you've got this small space before reaction.
I hope nobody punches somebody in the face after this podcast.
Right. Don't go out and punch people in the face.
Punch people.
If you get nothing else out of this podcast.
You're right.
But so what do we do in that moment? Because I think that's the hardest moment, where your emotions are flared.
So when we are in a fight, flight, or freeze response, science tells us that our brain, the blood in our brain is actually depleted, and it goes to our major organs for protection, and it goes to our major muscle groups for fighting. And it's our body's way of protecting itself. It's its natural way of protecting itself. But if we don't want to continue down that path, we need to remember that we need a pattern, what we call a pattern interrupt. And it's that moment in time where we take that brief second. And we teach our clients this all the time. It's this idea of mindful breathing. It's taking a breath in through your nose for 4 or 5 seconds, holding it for 3 or 4 seconds, and then blowing out your mouth for as far as you can go. And it's that mindful breath that is that pattern interrupt. It actually will interrupt the blood flow, and it'll actually send it back to the brain. So now we can think. So it's funny. It's a split second piece that takes, but we have to be aware of it.
Yeah. Are there any other exercises that somebody can do with the mad that they're feeling to help mitigate that or redirect it, similar to the breathing exercise?
Well, sure. I think that's where we begin to study the idea of mindfulness, and we have therapists here that are really good at that mindfulness piece. One of my favorite ones to do is just to begin to notice. It's a grounding exercise, right? When we're mad, we're not grounded. We're flighty. We're in our fight, flight, or freeze piece. And so this idea that everybody's out to get us, or is that feeling.
You mean grounded in reality?
Grounded, thank you. Yeah, grounded in reality. We're not flying or anything like that. But no, grounded in reality in that. And so the best way to ground in reality is going, okay, what are 4 things that I see? And so you begin to look in your environment. Okay, I see a tree. I see a white car. I see bushes. You're right. And so I'm now grounded to what I see. What are 5 things that I smell? And so it really gets us to focus in on this idea that we begin to come back to this reality of I'm okay.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. Mindfulness piece, guided imagery. Something you have to do with a therapist, but there's an app that we like it's called Stop, Breathe, and Think.
Okay.
It's a free app but it does guided meditations for you, guided imageries for you, and helps you walk through that, which is really good.
Yeah.
Coloring is a big deal now with some people. You get your art out and start coloring through some things. Those kinds of things I think are really a big deal.
Yeah. And then I know that you wanted to talk about if we're in this situation where we've been punched in the face and we're having to process through all this information, it may be a little bit too late.
You don't suddenly learn how to be a mechanic when your car's on fire. Like that imagery.
Yeah.
Right? So it's this idea of working on things when things are going well. It's becoming more aware of who you are and your surroundings when things are going well. It's practicing these tools when things are going well, so that when things go awry, we're able to work on it well.
Yeah. As we're talking, I'm realizing that we may have missed an important first step to this conversation of what is mad? What is it? What is the emotion of anger?
Well, anger is a response to stimuli. However, that's a normal reaction, right? It's a reactionary thing.
Yeah.
But if we talk about anger along a continuum, what it is this idea that it's very much a secondary emotion.
Explain that a little bit.
So it's something that fills the void of a different emotion. And so if we're not emotionally intelligent, anger is going to be our go-to response. But we know that in a lot of guys, anger is a secondary emotion to depression and sadness.
So you may be feeling depression or sadness, but it's coming out as anger.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yes. And especially with guys. In a society that we've told not to feel, don't cry, don't show sadness or weakness, it comes out as anger because we don't know what else to do with it.
So contrary to what we talked about earlier in this podcast, it kind of sounds like this is saying that anger is an easier emotion for some of us than sadness and depression. Yeah. Some of these emotions that we don't want to work through or experience, we experience through anger because it's easier.
Right, because who's in control with anger? Or who do we think is in control with
Yeah,
anger?
I was about to say,
let me
it would
rephrase
seem
that.
as if you're in control, but I know that's wrong.
But you feel in control. You think that you're in control with anger. There's power to that. So it's a go-to emotion for guys. Yeah. It's a lot less, it's a lot more scary to say, you know what, I'm sad, or I'm freaked out, or I'm depressed, or I'm anxious, which are things that we're going to talk about in the future podcast. It's this idea that to be really honest with ourselves, anger is actually masking something else.
And so as we dive in to some of these quote unquote harder emotions, we may find that they're actually the easy emotions covering up the hard emotions.
Yes. And we don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
So listeners, hang tight with us because we want to be able to explore this with you more. But don't just write us off because now we've taken away maybe some of your justifications.
Yeah. And as we continue these conversations talking about vulnerability and humility, being humble enough and vulnerable enough to be strong and say, okay, yeah, I do have these things that I'm recognizing that I want to work through out of that growth mindset, out of that desire to become the best you can be. It's going to be hard and it's going to take time and it's not going to be as enjoyable as you thought it would be.
And it's worth it.
Yes.
And I want our listeners, if you're curious, go back and YouTube some of Dr. Rogers's, shows because he breaks it down. And not to placate you as a listener or not to dumb down your intelligence. And yet there's something beautiful about his episodes talking to a child that might help us get it.
Well, and he ends the song, "What Do You Do?" by saying, someday a girl can be a woman and someday a boy can be a man, and says, that's true. You're becoming a man or a woman. And that's such identity because he's not saying like, you're going to be this gender, you're going to be this gender. He's saying you're going to be a mighty man or a mighty woman. You're going to be somebody who is awesome and the best you can be, and you're going to be mature and capable and indomitable.
We don't teach that anymore.
No, and I don't think we communicate that to each other either. That, hey, Mark, you're becoming a man.
Well, thanks. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Right.
But I know even for me,
hearing
as
that spoken into.
As a 25-year-old man,
sure,
that is something highly encouraging to hear from others. Of like, you know what, Trevor, you're becoming quite the man.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, and we don't speak identity into each other anymore. It's just maybe another podcast that we can do. But this idea that we don't, part of the reason I think we have so many struggles in the last 20 years is that we don't talk about these things anymore. We don't teach emotions. We don't value that the way we should anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be continuing this conversation talking about anxiety and sadness, and some of these harder emotions, talking through exercises we can do in the midst of that emotion, and some more educational pieces on let's dive in and see what that emotion really is. And maybe it's not what we had originally thought it was. I'm looking forward to this a lot. I'm super excited that we get to have conversations around Mr. Rogers' content, because he was such a, I mean, just going back over the past few weeks and watching some of those YouTube videos of episodes, it's so reminding of who I can be.
Yes.
And an encouraging piece. He did such a good job of encouraging his viewers in their identity. And I hope that as we go forward, our listeners feel that same thing from us.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/candid conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.